We, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty.
Cleared for the murder of Trayvon Martin. In a case that's divided the nation, protesters take to the streets as the race debates reignited. But was it a racially motivated killing? And what does it mean for the US and its justice system? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Veronica Pedroza. Not guilty. After a 3-week trial and 16 hours of deliberation, George Zimmerman was cleared of the murder of Trayvon Martin. Zimmerman shot and killed the black teenager as he walked home. Martin was unarmed. The shooting caused a national public outcry after it took 44 days to arrest Zimmerman. And Sunday's verdict led to widespread protests across the country and raised major questions about race in America.
We live in greater fear of the U.S. justice system and regular individuals every day because it's been a common thing since the 50s. It's okay to kill a black person.
There's so much racism inherent in America and our judicial system. People are upset, communities are upset, people don't feel safe with their kids on the streets. For black children, for all of our children, it's important that we're out here, and that's why I'm out here.
He could have been my son, and he could have been anybody's son. And so I knew it was wrong. It's just I had to come out and show my support for the family and for all the people who have lost their children unjustifiably due to these type of circumstances.
Well, President Obama was quick to respond to the public outcry. He said, "The death of Trayvon Martin was a tragedy, not just for his family or for any one community, but for America. I know this case has elicited strong passions, and in the wake of the verdict, I know those passions may be running even higher. But we are a nation of laws, and a jury has spoken." Let's bring in our guests then. In Orlando, Vanessa Brailey. She is a criminal defense attorney for Nejam Law, and last year her firm turned down the chance to represent Zimmerman. In Chicago, Gary Young, writer and columnist for the Guardian newspaper. And in Boston, Margaret Burnham, professor of law and director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, Northeastern University. Thanks very much to you all. Beginning with you in Orlando, Vanessa Brailey, could you have predicted this outcome? What was the reason for your firm not taking up Zimmerman's defense?
Well, there are some confidentiality reasons, but essentially, you know, our senior partner turned it down. He didn't agree with the charges that were being filed, and we also had a conflict of interest. So we obviously have to defer to that conflict of interest.
And what do you make of the verdict?
The not guilty verdict, I honestly had called it. I would have been upset if it were any other way. I think that the law was followed, and I think it was appropriate.
What do you think, Gary Young? Was it fair?
No, it certainly wasn't fair. It might have been legal, but there are many things that are legal and are not fair. I don't think there's any, there can be any denying many of the salient facts there in terms of George Zimmerman claiming self-defense. And yet he was the person who pursued Trayvon Martin. He actually pursued him, even though the dispatcher suggested that he should not pursue him. And that if George Zimmerman had been minding his own business that night, then Trayvon Martin would still be alive. Trayvon Martin wasn't doing anything wrong. George Zimmerman simply saw him and thought he was suspicious.
Let me ask you, do you think the jury made a mistake?
About who was on top of...
What do you think the jury made a mistake? Do you think that the laws are incorrect, well, that they're not just?
I think that the prosecution did not make a great case, and that part of that problem is that the state which did the prosecuting actually took 44 days before they took this seriously as anything, you know, as something that they should do. The Zimmerman wasn't arrested for 44 days. So there was the people bringing the case did not believe that there was a case for a significant period of time when there was a lot of evidence out there. Also, it's a very difficult thing to prove in terms of self-defense, because it's not just he said and he said, it's he said and he's dead. That one of the key persons in this tragic drama is Trayvon Martin, and he's dead, so he can't speak for himself. And so, given the evidence, I thought there was a fair chance that Zimmerman would walk. But at the end of the day, you've got to ask: is it just that a young boy walking home from the store to his house, doing nothing wrong, should be shot dead when he's unarmed?
Margaret Burnham, restorative justice, in which you work, is an approach to justice that focuses on the needs of victims, offenders, as well as the community, instead of satisfying abstract legal principles or punishing the offender. And you're a long-time activist as well when it comes to civil rights. Can you put this case into context for us? How significant is it?
Well, I think it's enormously significant in as much as it really is a flashpoint for the historic injustices that African Americans have experienced, not only from the perspective of history, but also they have personal experiences. The real central problem here, and I think Gary's really put his finger on it, and it's a problem for our justice system, is that Trayvon Martin was really not seen either by George Zimmerman or by the police, who took 44 days to arrest Mr. Zimmerman, or it appears by the jury for who he really was, which was a barely 17-year-old boy, young man, teenager, going out to buy some candy. And it's that fact that has gotten people outraged and has really lit a tinderbox and speaks so sharply to the continuing inadequacies of our justice system to accommodate people on an equal basis and notwithstanding their race. Race was all over this case. Race explains this case, and so it's impossible to say that we have the best justice system in the world, or that we have it's as good as it could be, when it's not a system that can recognize the critical importance that race plays at every step along the way today.
All right, let's look at the timeline for this case, because the jury's decision comes nearly a year and a half after Martin was killed by Zimmerman. Let's take a look at how we got here. Trayvon Martin was killed on a night in February in 2012. The murder sparked outrage. A petition calling for Zimmerman to be charged with murder reached over 2 million signatures. And in New York, hundreds marched calling for justice. It wasn't until April that Zimmerman was charged, and after entering a not guilty plea, he was eventually released with a bond of $1 million. More than a year later, his trial began. Prosecutor John Guy opened by saying Zimmerman killed Martin because, quote, because he wanted to. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, and on Saturday, Zimmerman was acquitted by a 6-woman jury accepting his argument of self-defense. Vanessa, Brailey, do you want to go into more details explaining your view about the verdict, given what we've just heard from Margaret Burnham and Gary Young?
Well, we obviously have to address the political pressures here. As you stated, there was an outcry in the beginning because Zimmerman wasn't arrested, so the civil rights activists felt in a fair amount of time. There was that political pressure. The arrest affidavit, it's been alleged that that was forged by Angela Corey, and from that point forward, the charge, that second-degree charge, I think was a product of the political pressure that we were getting.
Just
that
to
charge is a very high burden,
who
and there
Angela
were no
Corey
facts.
is.
Angela Corey is the district attorney for Seminole County, so she was overseeing the state attorney and the prosecution team.
Right, so she became involved, and you think... Sorry, go ahead, Gary Young. I can see you want to interrupt.
Well, just the notion that there is a problem with political pressure. Laws are made by people, by legislators. So all laws are political. And you have to imagine the politics of, because it wasn't actually Trayvon's murder that sparked outrage so much as the fact that the man who murdered him was free. And was free on the basis of the stand your ground laws. Now you have to imagine the politics of a country that allows a 17-year-old boy to be shot dead and doesn't arrest the person who does it. So of course there was political pressure. In a couple of months that's seen Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning, the notion that these laws stand outside of politics, I think is kind of farcical. Yes, there was political pressure. It wasn't a show trial, and that doesn't mean that there wasn't a case to be answered. Unless you think that shooting a 17-year-old black boy on his way home from the store does not demand some kind of judicial intervention.
You've gone so far as in your article for The Guardian yesterday, calling it open season on black boys as a result of this verdict. Isn't that a bit dramatic?
I asked whether it was open season.
Yes.
Well, I didn't say that. I said,
where does the concern?
Is it open season on black boys? And
where does that concern come from? Isn't that a bit overdramatic?
Two things. First of all, no, it's not, and I'm about to explain. There are two reasons. First of all, you have to imagine, and this is the sentence that comes before it, I say, what scenario was there by which Trayvon Martin gets home that night? If he ran, he would have been a suspect. If he stops, he's a suspect. How does Trayvon Martin get back from the store alive when George Zimmerman spots him? I don't know a scenario for that. I don't know what to tell my son.
Isn't this just as much about
what do I tell my son? If someone approaches you in the street, well, hang on, I have not finished. What do I tell my son? What do we tell black boys? Stay at home. That's the only thing that we can tell them. So secondly, this case takes place in a context of mass stop and frisk throughout the country, where the New York Police Commissioner says to a state senator, I believe that what we have to do is terrorize these neighborhoods, black and Latino neighborhoods he's talking about, so that they know that as soon as they step out of the house, they are fair game. That's the country that we live in. That's America. That sounds to me like it could be open season on young black boys. And what I would respond to your question is, if it's not open season on young black men, how does Trayvon Martin get home that night? How does he get home alive when George Zimmerman is following him? What are his options?
Well, look, there are a lot of gun crimes that are committed with black on black people and other ethnicities as well. How much is this really about race as much as it is about gun control? And I'm going to put this to all of you.
You haven't answered my question. Answer my question. How does he get home? What does he do? George Zimmerman is following him. Zimmerman is armed. He is not. How does he get home that night from the store?
You know
because that's the question that preceded my statement. Is it open season on young black men? So answer that.
Let me put that instead to Vanessa, who I can see is speaking.
Right. Well, to be honest, it's not necessarily just about him walking home safely. We have to understand that the letter of the law was followed. We keep skipping a very important part here, which is the actual fight that they were in, the confrontation. The justifiable use of force statute provides for one to defend themselves when they are in reasonable fear that they are being injured. And at that point, that was what was going through Zimmerman's mind. We have to apply that to the case here. Just because we have someone walking home with some candy and there seems to be some sort of an innocence here going on, we cannot use Zimmerman as our punching bag for why we think that this was unjust. You have to apply the letter of the law, and the letter of the law was followed. They found that there was justifiable use of force here. Nobody was there to witness that. The evidence was all in Zimmerman's favor, black and white. He was on the bottom. He was being hit. He was scared and feared for his life, and he defended himself.
Well, this notion, I mean, what Vanessa just painted there is a kind of actually afactual, because there is no question that Zimmerman sees Trayvon Martin and follows him. He's actually, it's suggested to him by the dispatcher that he not follow him. So the point at which he gets into an altercation with Trayvon Martin is an altercation of his making, not of Trayvon Martin's making.
It is not against the law to follow somebody. It is not against the law.
And that's your answer? It's not against the law to follow somebody. But somehow George Zimmerman claims self-defense when he's following Trayvon Martin, and Trayvon Martin feels, according to the phone calls, senses that he's being followed. And then what happens after that, I think, you know, is actually kind of details, and we don't know what those details are because Trayvon Martin's dead.
All right.
But we know in the run-up to that, that if George Zimmerman had stayed in his car, that Trayvon Martin would still be alive.
Margaret Burnham, let me ask you to address this issue of gun control, please, and how it kind of overlaps with the issue of race relations.
Well, this is clearly, as the President has indicated, this is clearly a question of whether we've adequately addressed the issues of guns on the streets in the United States. But more importantly, I mean, that's certainly part of it, but more importantly is the question of whether or not, the question that Gary puts of what this says about our justice system today, that you can have this kind of result in a case which most Americans do think is a bit outrageous, that a young boy goes out to get candy and ends up dead, and there's nothing that our justice system, there's no adequate, it does not appear to be any adequate response from our justice system for a multiplicity of reasons, but at the end of the day, there's no remedy for Trayvon Martin or for his parents, and that's really the key factor here, is that this was in fact a tragedy and a travesty as far as Trayvon Martin is concerned. Guns certainly play a role in it. Certainly someone who is licensed to carry a gun, as George Zimmerman was, should be mindful when the police tell him to stand down, that he should in fact stand down, that he's the one with the weapon. Trayvon Martin is armed only with his candy. So certainly this is about gun control, but I think in a way that the question of gun control really ought not to be allowed to overshadow the larger issue, the larger question this case does raise about the ongoing inadequacies of our justice system, which has failed to provide for equal access, equal treatment now for many decades, 150 years.
There have been a couple of reactions that I want to mention here. The civil rights movement, the NAACP, is seeking the Department of Justice intervention and targeting those stand your ground laws across the country as a result of this verdict on Zimmerman. The Coalition to Stop Gun Violence has declared in a press release that murder has now been legalized in half of the 50 states as a result of laws like Stand Your Ground. I want to ask you, Vanessa Brailey, if you think there is going to be DOJ intervention and indeed a civil rights case.
Well, I do think that this is really going to bring the focus to, and this has been a focus in this country, and particularly Florida for a long time, is the way that these laws are written with respect to stand your ground and our self-defense laws. I do think that we're going to, on the back end of this case, revisit those issues, but that's what happens when there's a decision that the public doesn't feel is just, is you petition the courts, you contact your governors, and the legislation is changed. The fact that there's an intervention here is just, obviously people are upset, and it is a tragedy, but we do have to go about it the way that we normally go about these things, and if the law needs to be changed, then it needs to be changed, but it will be done so by way of the process as usual.
Gary Young, plug into the mood that we have on the streets at the moment with these riots. Do you think that they're going to go on?
I hope so.
No,
I hope that they remain peaceful, but
Go
on, Margaret.
I think there will be I think there'll be a continuing.
I hope they do go on.
That this has reminded people once again of the failures of the criminal justice system, and that there will be a continuing focus on criminal justice and criminal justice and race in our country. And to the extent that this opens up that conversation again, so that all of us, all Americans, can engage in it in a way that is productive and in a way that we can hear each other, in a way that people can hear the fears of African American parents, that is a good thing. That is a good thing. And if people take to the streets and express their anger in the streets, if they're also expressing their anger in classrooms and in churches and in other public places, all of this is all to the good. It's all to the advancement of ultimately understanding how far it is we have yet to go.
All right.
And I just want to say on the criminal case, on the government's on the federal government's charge, I think the federal government has been investigating this for some time, and rightly so. This does involve the civil rights of Trayvon Martin. Whether or not the federal government has the tools actually to pursue a criminal case is really, I think, questionable, because the government would have to prove that this was a hate crime. They'd have to prove motive on the part of Zimmerman, and motive was apparently the area in which the Florida prosecution fell down. So they would face the same challenges that were faced in Florida on proving that Zimmerman acted out of a racial animus towards young Trayvon Martin.
Right, and finally, Gary Young, if I can ask you to be brief.
Okay, so look, I think that the death of a young man walking home from the store who's unarmed, I think that's worth protesting about, and I hope people do protest, and that protest is how we get these laws changed, and it's also how we focus people's minds on the broader question of criminal justice in America, because it's not, Trayvon Martin is actually his generation, depending on where they are, they're at risk of stop and frisk from the police. They're at risk of people like George Zimmerman. They're at risk of getting higher sentences, longer sentences, more likely to go to jail. There is a totality of risk, and I think the real issue here, as one commentator said previously, my real fear isn't actually riots, it's more George Zimmerman's. It's more George Zimmerman's, that this is something worth protesting. So I hope people do protest, and I hope they do so peacefully.
All right. Before we close the program, I just want to let you know that we have had lots of reaction to this story on Facebook once we said that this was going to be the topic. For example, Sarah Huddleston saying that I am not American, but I don't see how you can pick up a gun and shoot a young boy passing by your home for no particular reason, unless you're mentally ill and dangerous or a criminal. Either way, surely you should be removed from society. Matthew E. Reuther makes the point, there is really only one way to look at this. If an armed man follows your child and your child is gunned down in the resulting confrontation, is that just? The precedent set in Florida is this: if you arm yourself, stalk a child, provoke a fight, and then kill that child, you are not guilty. And Husna Simba says, so why aren't people talking about how many black kids are getting gunned down by members of their own community? It's a whole lot of them. That's a much bigger problem than this media circus. All right, thank you to all my guests, Vanessa Brailey, Gary Young, and Margaret Burnham. This is a debate that is going to, of course, go on as it should. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want, send your feedback by email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. Goodbye.